What started as a cruel punishment became a journey that would transform not just a wayward son, but the very legacy of one of America's most powerful families. When wealth meets simplicity, no one could have predicted the shocking outcome that would leave even a hardened billionaire speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maxwell Harrison III stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, 60 stories above the bustling streets of Chicago. The city's skyline glittered beneath him like a carpet of diamonds, a testament to the Harrison empire he had built from nothing. Everything he surveyed was, in some way, touched by his influence. Every skyscraper, every business deal, every political connection. Everything except his only son. The oppressive silence of the office was broken by the sound of his intercom. "Mr. Harrison, your son has arrived." His assistant's voice carried a subtle note of disapproval that Maxwell appreciated. At least someone else recognized what a disappointment Ethan had become. "Send him in," Maxwell commanded, not turning from the window. He wanted Ethan to feel the full weight of his displeasure, to understand that this time would be different from all the others. The heavy oak door swung open, and Maxwell heard the uneven footsteps of his son crossing the Italian marble floor. Even from here, he could smell the mixture of expensive cologne and stale alcohol. "You wanted to see me?" Ethan Harrison's voice carried the distinctive slur of someone who had been drinking since noon, though he'd made a poor attempt to mask it with breath mints. Maxwell waited a beat longer before turning, letting his son stew in the silence. When he finally faced Ethan, what he saw only confirmed his decision. The 30-year-old heir to the Harrison fortune stood swaying slightly in an obviously slept-in designer suit, his bloodshot eyes betraying last night's excesses. The tabloid photos that had landed on Maxwell's desk that morning, showing Ethan in a compromising position with a married celebrity, were merely the latest in a string of embarrassments. "Sit down," Maxwell said, his voice cold and controlled. Ethan dropped into the leather chair across from his father's massive desk, an irreverent smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Let me guess. Another lecture about upholding the family. Name? Or have you called me in to cut my allowance again?" He chuckled at his own joke, clearly not taking the meeting seriously. Maxwell remained standing, his imposing figure framed by the Chicago skyline behind him. The contrast wasn't lost on him. The city that represented his life's work versus the spoiled man-child who seemed determined to undo it all. "I received a call from Senator Chambers this morning," Maxwell said, watching his son's face carefully. He was concerned that some indiscretions involving his daughter might make their way to the press. Ethan rolled his eyes. "She's 24 and separated from her husband. Hardly a scandal. She's the daughter of the chairman of the Finance Committee, a committee currently reviewing legislation that would directly impact our business," Maxwell countered, his voice rising slightly. "But that's not why you're here." He pressed a button on his desk, and his assistant entered silently, placing a thick folder in front of Ethan before withdrawing. The folder was emblazoned with the Harrison Enterprises logo, looking official and ominous. "What's this?" Ethan asked, not bothering to open it. "Your future," Maxwell replied simply. Something in his tone must have registered with Ethan because the smirk faded from his face. He reluctantly opened the folder. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, standing in what appeared to be an orchard. Her simple clothes and sun-weathered face were a stark contrast to the polished socialites Ethan typically pursued. "Who is she?" Ethan asked, confusion evident in his voice. "Her name is Sarah Mitchell. She runs an organic farm in rural Wisconsin that's been in her family for 5 generations. And you're going to marry her." The words hung in the air between them. For a moment, Ethan looked genuinely stunned, as if waiting for the punchline to an elaborate joke. When Maxwell's expression remained deadly serious, Ethan burst into laughter. "Good one, Dad." For a second there— "I'm not joking, Ethan," Maxwell interrupted, his voice like steel. "The Mitchell farm produces organic produce for some of the finest restaurants in the Midwest. Sarah has single-handedly modernized their approach while maintaining their heritage techniques. She works harder before breakfast than you have in your entire privileged life." Ethan's laughter died abruptly. "This is insane. You can't just—" "The farm is facing foreclosure," Maxwell continued as if Ethan hadn't spoken. "I've offered to save it, to invest in its future, to ensure its continued operation. In exchange, Sarah has agreed to this arrangement." Ethan stood so quickly that his chair toppled backward, crashing against the floor. "Are you out of your mind? This isn't the 19th century. You can't arrange marriages." "I can and I have," Maxwell said calmly, unmoved by his son's outburst. "You have two choices, Ethan. You marry Sarah Mitchell and spend 1 year living and working on her farm, or I cut you off, completely. No money, no trust fund, no penthouse, no cars, nothing." "You're bluffing," Ethan said, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Maxwell walked around the desk until he was face to face with his son. Even in his 60s, Maxwell Harrison was an intimidating presence. Tall, fit, with piercing blue eyes that had stared down corporate raiders and hostile boards. "Test me and find out," he said quietly. "The prenuptial agreement has been drafted. Sarah has reviewed it. All that's missing is your signature." Ethan's face flushed with anger. "And if I refuse, if I walk out that door? Then you'll discover just how quickly the Harrison name becomes meaningless when it's not backed by Harrison money," Maxwell said. "Your credit cards will be cancelled before the elevator reaches the lobby. Your accounts frozen by the time you reach the street. The keys to your penthouse will no longer work. Your so-called friends will discover you're not worth their time when you can't pay for bottle service." Ethan's expression shifted from anger to something closer to panic. "This is ridiculous. A farmer in Wisconsin for a year. This isn't a— "Listen, Dad, this is punishment. Call it what you want," Maxwell said, unmoved. "The wedding is scheduled for next week. Private ceremony, immediate departure afterward. 1 year, Ethan. Prove to me that you can be responsible, that you can contribute something of value, and after that year, we'll discuss your future with the company." Ethan stared at his father, searching for any sign of compromise, any hint that this might be a bluff. He found none. Maxwell Harrison had built an empire through unwavering determination and ruthless business tactics. Ethan knew that look, the one that had crushed competitors and secured billion-dollar deals. "You have until tomorrow to decide," Maxwell said, turning back to the window, effectively dismissing his son as he would any other insignificant meeting. Ethan stood frozen, the folder clutched in his trembling hand. As he finally turned to leave, neither father nor son could possibly imagine how this ultimatum would change not just Ethan's life, but Maxwell's carefully constructed empire as well. 3 days later, Ethan Harrison found himself in the back of a sleek black sedan, watching Chicago's familiar skyline recede into the distance. His fingers drummed nervously against his thigh as the urban landscape gradually gave way to suburbs, then to farmland. The drive to Wisconsin felt like a journey into exile. Beside him sat a stack of leather luggage containing only a fraction of his wardrobe. His father's instructions had been clear: pack practical clothes, leave the Italian suits and designer shoes behind. Ethan had ignored this advice, of course. The idea of not looking his best, even in rural obscurity, was unthinkable. "How much longer?" he asked the driver, a stoic man who had worked for Harrison Enterprises for years. "About 2 hours, Mr. Harrison," the driver replied, making eye contact. Through the rearview mirror, was that pity Ethan detected in the man's gaze. The thought made his stomach turn. The wedding had been a cold, sterile affair in his father's penthouse. No friends, no celebration, just a justice of the peace, his father and the bride. Sarah Mitchell had worn a simple white dress, her chestnut, hair pulled back in a style that seemed deliberately unfashionable. She had barely spoken throughout the ceremony, offering only quiet, efficient responses when required. Ethan had been too shocked by the reality of the situation to form much of an impression of her. She wasn't unattractive. Her features were symmetrical enough, her eyes a warm hazel, but she lacked the polished glamour of the women in his social circle. She was neither impressed by him nor intimidated, which was disconcerting in itself. The prenuptial agreement sat heavily in his briefcase. 1 year. That was the deal. 1 year of rural imprisonment, and then he could return to civilization with his inheritance intact. He'd spend his days keeping his head down, going through the motions, and counting the seconds until his sentence was complete. His phone buzzed with a message from his best friend, Alex. "Dude, where are you? Thought we were hitting vapor tonight. New DJ from Berlin." Ethan sighed, typing back, "Can't. Headed to Wisconsin. Long story, I'll explain later." He couldn't bring himself to share the full truth yet. That he, Ethan Harrison, Chicago's most eligible bachelor and fixture of the city's nightlife, had been essentially banished to a farm and forced into marriage with a woman he'd met only twice. The landscape outside his window grew increasingly rural. Fields stretched endlessly on either side of the highway, punctuated by the occasional cluster of trees or isolated farmhouse. It was alien territory to Ethan, who could navigate the exclusive clubs and restaurants of Chicago with his eyes closed, but couldn't tell corn from wheat if his life depended on it. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Miranda, his on-again, off-again girlfriend. "Haven't heard from you in days. Are we still on for the charity gala Saturday?" He stared at the message, uncertain how to respond. What was he supposed to tell her? "Sorry, can't make it. I'm married now." The absurdity of his situation struck him anew, and he shoved the phone back into his pocket without replying. As they turned off the main highway onto increasingly narrow roads, Ethan's anxiety spiked. The sedan, designed for smooth city streets, bounced uncomfortably on the rural routes. The Wi-Fi hotspot started to flicker, and his phone signal dropped to a single bar. "We're losing civilization," he muttered, watching his last connection to his real life fade away. "Cell coverage is spotty out here, Mr. Harrison," the driver confirmed, offering no solution. After what felt like an eternity of rural monotony, the car turned onto a long, tree-lined drive. A wooden sign reading, "Mitchell Family Farms, Esther 1897, hung from an arched gateway. The gravel crunched beneath the sedan's tires as they drove toward a 2-story farmhouse that looked like something from a country living magazine. The house was white, with dark green shutters, a wraparound porch dotted with rocking chairs, and flower boxes brimming with colorful blooms. Behind it stood a massive red barn and several outbuildings. Fields stretched in all directions, and in the distance Ethan could make out an orchard of some kind. It was picturesque in a way that made his skin crawl. Too perfect, too wholesome, too far from everything he knew and loved. The car stopped in front of the house, and Ethan remained seated, staring out at what would be his prison for the next year. The driver cleared his throat. "We've arrived, Mr. Harrison." "I can see that," Ethan snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. It wasn't the driver's fault. "Sorry, just give me a minute." Before he could gather himself, the farmhouse door opened, and Sarah stepped out onto the porch. She had changed from her wedding dress into jeans and a simple blue shirt, her hair now in a practical braid. She stood waiting, not coming down to greet him, her stance suggesting she was merely pausing in the middle of more important tasks. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped out of the car, his Italian leather shoes immediately sinking slightly into the soft ground. The air smelled different here, cleaner, filled with unfamiliar sense of soil and vegetation. The silence was oppressive, broken only by distant bird calls and the gentle rustling of leaves. The driver began unloading Ethan's luggage, placing the expensive cases on the gravel driveway. Ethan stood, awkwardly unsure of the proper protocol for arriving at your new wife's farm after an arranged marriage. "You brought a lot," Sarah commented, her eyes taking in the pile of luggage. Her voice was neither judgmental nor welcoming, simply observational. "I wasn't sure what I'd need," Ethan replied, attempting a charming smile that felt strained even to him. Sarah didn't return the smile. "Most of that will just stay packed. There's not much call for—" She glanced at a monogrammed garment bag. "And whatever's in there." Before Ethan could respond, the driver handed him a sealed envelope. "From Mr. Harrison, sir." Ethan took it, knowing what it contained. His father's final instructions and reminders of their agreement. The driver nodded respectfully, returned to the car, and within moments was heading back down the driveway, taking with him Ethan's last link to his former life. The sound of the car faded, leaving Ethan standing amid his luggage, facing a woman who was legally his wife, but effectively a stranger, in a place as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. "We should get your things inside," Sarah said, descending the porch steps. "It looks like rain." Ethan glanced up at the sky, which had darkened with clouds he hadn't noticed earlier. Great. Even the weather was conspiring against him. "I'll take these," Sarah said, effortlessly picking up two of the heaviest suitcases, as if they weighed nothing. "You can manage the rest, I assume?" Ethan stared at her retreating back as she carried his luggage up the porch steps and into the house. He was used to doormen and assistants handling such tasks. Reluctantly, he gathered as many bags as he could carry, his muscles protesting at the unfamiliar strain. The interior of the farmhouse was surprisingly spacious and bright, with wooden floors, comfortable-looking furniture, and windows that let in natural light. It was clean and well-maintained, but distinctly rustic. No marble countertops or designer furniture here. "The guest room is yours," Sarah said, leading him upstairs. "Bathroom's down the hall. We share it." The guest room was small by Ethan's standards, with a simple double bed, a wooden dresser, and a chair by the window. A handmade quilt covered the bed, and curtains in a faded floral pattern framed the view of the orchard behind the house. "This is it?" Ethan couldn't help asking. Sarah paused in the doorway. "Were you expecting the presidential suite at the Four Seasons?" For the first time, he detected a hint of emotion in her voice, a sharp edge of sarcasm that caught him off. "God, no, I just—" He trailed off, realizing there was no good way to finish that sentence. "Dinner's at 6, Sarah said, her tone neutral once more. "Kitchen's downstairs. You can unpack or rest or whatever you need to do. Just stay out of the north field. We've got irrigation work happening there." With that, she turned and left, him alone in the small room. Her footsteps retreating down the wooden staircase, Ethan sank onto the edge of the bed, which creaked under his weight. The reality of his situation crashed over him in waves. He was miles from civilization, married to a woman who clearly had no interest in him, and facing a year of— what? Farming? Manual labor? Rustic boredom? He pulled out his phone, desperate for some connection to his real life, only to find he had no service inside the house. Moving to the window didn't help. 1 year without reliable Wi-Fi? Without his friends, his clubs, his lifestyle? Thunder rumbled in the distance as rain began to patter against the window. Ethan stared out at the unfamiliar landscape being slowly obscured by sheets of rain, feeling more isolated than he had in his entire life. 1 year, 365 days. He could do this. He had to do this. As the rain intensified, transforming the idyllic farm scene into a grey blur, Ethan Harrison, socialite, playboy, and reluctant new husband, closed his eyes, and tried to imagine surviving a single week in this place, let alone a year. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, its resonant tones echoing through the farmhouse. Ethan had spent the last 2 hours unpacking only the essentials, arranging his expensive toiletries in the rustic bathroom, and trying unsuccessfully to find a spot in the house with reliable cell reception. Finally giving up, he made his way downstairs, guided by the unmistakable aroma of home cooking. The kitchen was the heart of the farmhouse, spacious and warm, with copper pots hanging from a ceiling rack and herbs growing in pots along the windowsill. Sarah stood at an old gas range, stirring something in a cast-iron skillet. She had changed into a fresh shirt, but was still wearing the same worn jeans. Her hair remained in its practical braid, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. She glanced up as he entered, but didn't pause in her cooking. "You can set the table," she said, nodding toward a stack of plates on the counter. "Silverware's in that drawer." Ethan blinked, momentarily stunned. He had never set a table in his life. In his world, tables appeared fully set in restaurants or were prepared by household staff before he entered the dining room. Where?" he asked, feeling foolish. Sarah looked at him properly then, her expression a mixture of disbelief and resignation. "The plates go on the table, one at each place, then a fork on the left, knife and spoon on the right." The simplicity of the instruction made Ethan feel even more out of place. Wordlessly, he took the plates and began setting them on the wooden table that dominated one end of the kitchen. The domestic activity felt alien, like he was playing a role in someone else's life. "Is there wine?" he asked, hopefully completing his awkward table arrangement. "No," Sarah replied. "Water or iced tea. Nothing stronger." "This is a working farm, not a cocktail lounge," she said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "Drinking happens after the work is done, not before or during. And even then, it's beer, not whatever $1,000 scotch you're probably used." 2. Ethan felt properly chastised, which was a novel and unpleasant sensation. "Water's fine," he muttered. Sarah brought over a simple meal of roast chicken, potatoes and vegetables, serving portions onto each plate before sitting down across from him. The food smelled incredible, better than many restaurants he'd frequented in Chicago. An uncomfortable silence settled between them as they began to eat. Ethan searched for something to say, some common ground they might share, but came up empty. What did one discuss with a farmer? The weather? Crop rotation? "This is good," he offered finally, gesturing to the food. "Thanks," Sarah replied without elaboration. Another painful silence. "So," Ethan tried again, "tell me about yourself." Sarah looked up from her plate, her hazel eyes studying him with an intensity that made him shift in his seat. "What exactly do you want to know?" "I don't know. Anything. We're married, after all. Legally, anyway." She set down her fork. "You want my biography? Fine. I'm 29, born and raised on this farm. Went to the University of Wisconsin for agricultural science. Came back when my father got sick. He died 3 years ago. Since then, I've been running this place on my own. 500 acres, 50 of which are organic orchards. We supply restaurants in Madison, Milwaukee, and Chicago. And until your father showed up with his offer, I was about 2 months away from losing it all to the bank." There was no self-pity in her voice, just a matter-of-fact recitation of her circumstances. Ethan was struck by how different her life path had been from his, focused, rooted in family obligation, marked by genuine struggle. "I'm sorry about your father," he said, finding he actually meant it. Sarah nodded once, accepting the condolence without comment. "Your turn," she said. "Tell me something real about Ethan Harrison that isn't in the tabloids." The question caught him off guard. What was there to tell? His life had been a carefully curated collection of privileges and indulgences. None of which would impress the practical woman sitting across from him. I have a degree in business from Northwestern, he offered. I'm good at racquetball. I collect vintage watches. Even to his own ears, these facts sounded hollow and inconsequential compared to her life story. "And what do you do at your father's company?" she asked. "What's your actual job?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I'm in business development." "What does that mean exactly?" "I attend meetings, network with clients, represent the Harrison brand at events." The vagueness of his own description made him wince internally. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Ethan thought he detected a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. "I see. Look," he said, suddenly defensive, "I know what you must think of me, poor little rich boy who's never worked a day in his life. But my father isn't exactly an easy man to please. Nothing I've ever done has been good enough for him." "And what exactly have you tried to do?" Sarah asked, her tone genuinely curious, rather than accusatory. The question landed like a punch to the gut, because Ethan couldn't think of a single meaningful endeavor he'd ever pursued with genuine effort. His days were filled with leisure and superficial social connections, his nights with expensive distractions. He began, then faltered. "It's complicated." Sarah nodded as if his non-answer had confirmed something for her. "Well, around here, things aren't complicated. The work needs doing, so we do it. The crops need tending, so we tend them. The animals need care, so we care for them. Simple. And is that fulfilling for you?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious despite himself. The simplicity of it all? For the first time, something like genuine emotion flickered across Sarah's face, a quiet pride that transformed her features. "This land has been in my family for 5 generations. When I walk these fields, I'm walking in the footsteps of my father, my grandfather, all the way back. Everything they built, everything they learned, it's in my hands now." She looked down at her palms, calloused and strong. "So, yes, it's fulfilling, more than you could possibly understand." Ethan found himself momentarily speechless. Her conviction was so genuine, so deeply felt, that it made his own existence seem shallow in comparison. "I guess I'll have to take your word for it," he said finally. "You won't have to take my word for much longer," Sarah replied. "Tomorrow, you start working. For real." Ethan nearly choked on his water. "Working? Like in the fields?" "That's generally what happens on a farm," Sarah said dryly. "Your father and I had an agreement. He saves the farm financially and you contribute actual labor for 1 year. That wasn't just for show." "But I don't know the first thing about farming," Ethan protested. "Then you'll learn," Sarah said simply. "Everyone starts somewhere." "I can't just—" "Wake up is at 5, Sarah interrupted, rising from the table and gathering her plate. "Breakfast at 5:30. We start work at 6. Wear the clothes your father told you to pack, not—" She gestured vaguely at his designer outfit. "Whatever that is." 5 in the morning, Ethan repeated, aghast. "That's not even a real time." Sarah actually smiled then, a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to farm life, Mr. Harrison. It's going to be a very interesting year." She placed her dishes in the sink and turned back to him. "There are a few ground rules. First, this is a working farm, not a vacation retreat. Everyone pulls their weight. Second, what happens here stays here. I don't need your drama splashed across social media. Third, this may be a marriage on paper, but let's be clear, it's a business arrangement, nothing more." The bluntness of her words stung Ethan's pride. "Trust me, I'm not exactly thrilled about this situation either." "Good. Then we understand each other." Sarah wiped her hands on a dish towel. "I'll be in the barn for another hour. Feel free to explore the house, but stay out of the fields until I can show you around tomorrow. The last thing I need is for you to get lost or hurt on your first night here." With that, she grabbed a jacket from a hook by the door and headed outside, leaving Ethan alone in the kitchen with the remains of their awkward first meal together. He sat there for several minutes, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the farmhouse, the ticking of the clock, the creak of the old wooden structure as it settled, the distant lowing of cattle from somewhere beyond the windows. Everything felt alien and isolating. Finally, he stood and carried his own plate to the sink, an act so unfamiliar it almost felt rebellious. Looking around the kitchen with its worn but cared-for furnishings, family photos on the wall, and herbs growing in the window, Ethan felt a strange pang of something he couldn't quite identify. This place was real in a way his life in Chicago had never been. The people here, or at least Sarah, lived with purpose and conviction. They built things, grew things, maintained traditions across generations. It made his own existence, filled with transient pleasures and superficial connections, seem flimsy by comparison. As night fell over the farm, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, Ethan Harrison, playboy, socialite, and reluctant farmhand, tried to imagine how he would possibly survive his first day of actual labor. 5 in the morning suddenly seemed not just unreasonably early, but impossibly distant from everything he had ever known. The shrill sound of an alarm pierced Ethan's consciousness, dragging him from a deep sleep. He fumbled blindly for his phone, desperate to silence the offending noise. The bedside clock read 5 a.m., a time he typically associated with coming home from a night out, not starting a day. "This has to be a joke," he muttered, burying his face in the pillow. He had barely managed to fall asleep, his body unaccustomed to the firm mattress and his mind racing with thoughts of escape. The farm's unfamiliar sounds, crickets, distant, animal calls, the creaking of the old house, had kept him awake for hours. A sharp knock on his door followed. "Up and moving, Harrison," Sarah's voice called through the wood. "Breakfast in 30 minutes. Ethan groaned but dragged himself out of bed. In the bathroom, he stared at his reflection in the small mirror. Designer stubble that had been intentional, now verging on unkempt, dark circles under his eyes. He looked like hell. After a quick shower in the farmhouse's temperamental plumbing, the water pressure nothing like his rainfall shower in Chicago, he reluctantly pulled on the only work clothes he'd brought, designer jeans that cost more than most people's entire wardrobe, and a cashmere sweater he considered casual. Downstairs, Sarah was already moving efficiently around the kitchen, dressed in worn jeans, sturdy boots, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. She barely glanced at him as he entered, instead nodding toward a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast on the table. "Eat," she instructed. "You'll need the energy." Ethan sat down, eyeing the simple but hearty breakfast. "I usually just have coffee, and maybe a protein shake. That might work for board meetings. It won't work in the fields." She poured him a mug of coffee, strong and black, nothing like the artisanal pour-overs he was used to, and set it beside his plate. "And you're going to need different clothes." Ethan looked down at his outfit. "What's wrong with these?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Those jeans probably cost more than I spend on clothes in a year, and they'll be ruined by noon. Do you have anything practical?" "This is practical," Ethan defended, "for my normal life." "This isn't your normal life anymore." Sarah sighed, checking her watch. "Fine. We'll stop by the storage shed after breakfast. I think I have some of my father's old clothes that might fit you." The idea of wearing a dead man's hand-me-downs made Ethan's skin crawl, but he knew better than to voice this thought. Instead, he reluctantly ate the breakfast, which was admittedly delicious despite its simplicity. "What exactly will I be doing today?" he asked between bites. "We're repairing fences in the north pasture and then checking on the irrigation system in the apple orchard," Sarah replied, washing her own plate. "Basic maintenance." Ethan had no concept of what basic maintenance entailed, but he nodded, as if he understood. His plan was simple: do the minimum required, complain enough to make his displeasure known, but not so much that Sarah would report back to his father. After all, this was just a temporary situation. A year would pass, and he'd be back in Chicago, inheriting his rightful place in Harrison Enterprises, with this farm life nothing but a distant, unpleasant memory. After breakfast, they stopped at a weathered shed where Sarah rummaged through some cardboard boxes, eventually producing faded work jeans, flannel shirts, and a pair of muddy boots. "These should fit well enough," she said, handing him the pile. "You can change in there." She nodded toward a small bathroom attached to the shed. Ethan stared at the clothes with unconcealed disgust. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious. Your designer outfit won't last an hour out here." Reluctantly, Ethan took the clothes and changed, emerging feeling like a costume party version of a farmer. The jeans were stiff and faded, the flannel shirt scratchy against his skin, and the boots at least half a size too big. Sarah looked him over and nodded once. "That's better. Now you look like you might actually survive the day." "I feel ridiculous. You look like everyone else who works on a farm," she countered, "which is what you're supposed to be doing." She handed him a pair of work gloves that had seen better days. "Let's go. We're burning daylight." The morning passed in a blur of physical labor unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. Sarah showed him how to repair broken fence posts, a task that involved digging holes, mixing concrete, and setting new posts, all manual labor that left his hands blistered despite the gloves and his back aching in places he didn't know could ache. "This is insane," he muttered, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow after they'd replaced their third post. "Don't you have machines for this? Or, I don't know, actual workers?" Sarah, who had been working steadily alongside him but showing none of his fatigue, straightened up. "We use machinery for the big jobs. Small repairs like this are done by hand. And we do have seasonal workers during harvest, but right now it's just us." "Can't we at least take a break?" Ethan asked, checking his watch. It wasn't even 10 a.m., and he felt like he'd run a marathon. "We've been working for 3 hours. Normal break is at 10:30, Sarah replied, unmoved by his obvious discomfort. 2 more posts, then we stop for water." Ethan bit back the sharp retort that rose to his lips. This woman was unbelievable, as unyielding as the earth they were digging through. He channeled his frustration into the work, imagining his father's face on each fence post as he hammered it into place. By noon, they had repaired a section of fence that stretched as far as Ethan could see. His hands were raw despite the gloves. His lower back screamed in protest, and his shoulders burned from the unaccustomed labor. When Sarah finally called for lunch, Ethan practically collapsed onto the tailgate of the old pickup truck they'd been using to transport materials. "Here!" Sarah handed him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a thermos of water. "Eat!" Ethan unwrapped the simple ham and cheese sandwich, too exhausted to even comment on its modest nature compared to his usual business lunches. He ate in silence, watching as Sarah pulled out her own lunch and ate with efficiency, her eyes scanning the horizon as if mentally cataloguing the next dozen tasks awaiting them. "Is it always like this?" he finally asked. "Every day, just endless physical labor?" Sarah took a sip of water before answering. "The tasks change with the seasons. Spring is planting and repairs, summer is irrigation and maintenance, fall is harvest, winter is planning, equipment maintenance, and orchard pruning." She shrugged. "But yes, it's always work. That's what a farm is." "How do you stand it?" The question slipped out before Ethan could stop it. Instead of taking offense, Sarah seemed to consider the question seriously. "It's not about standing it. It's about building something. Every fence post we set today, every irrigation line we check this afternoon, it all contributes to the health of the farm. The work has purpose." Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd done anything with genuine purpose. His days in Chicago were filled with meetings where nothing was decided, parties where nothing was celebrated, relationships where nothing was felt. The realization was uncomfortable, so he pushed it aside. "Well, I'm not built for this," he said, dismissively. "I have an MBA from Northwestern, not a certificate in ditch digging." Something like disappointment flickered across Sarah's face, but she merely shrugged. "Your father seems to think differently." She gathered the remains of her lunch and stood. "Break's over. We need to check the irrigation system before the afternoon heat kicks in." The irrigation system, it turned out, involved walking the long rows of apple trees, checking for leaks in the drip lines, and making repairs where necessary. It was less physically demanding than the fence repair, but required a meticulousness that Ethan found equally exhausting. "Why can't we just install a new system?" he asked after fixing his third leak. "Wouldn't that be more efficient than patching this old one?" "A new system would cost upwards of $50,000, Sarah replied, her eyes on the line she was examining. "The agreement with your father covers the mortgage and essential operating costs, not major upgrades." "I could make a call," Ethan suggested, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate his usefulness without physical labor. "I know people who could get you a deal on a state-of-the-art system." Sarah straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "This farm has survived for 5 generations without state-of-the-art anything. We make do with what we have, we repair what we can, and we replace only when necessary. That's how sustainable farming works." "But I don't need your connections, Ethan," she interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "I need your hands and your willingness to learn how things work here." That was the deal. Ethan felt properly chastised, which only fueled his resentment. Who was this woman to lecture him about sustainability and making do? He'd made more money in a single lucky poker game than she probably saw in a year. The afternoon stretched endlessly, each hour bringing new tasks that tested Ethan's limited endurance and non-existent farming knowledge. By the time they headed back to the farmhouse as the sun began to set, he was beyond exhausted. Every muscle ached, his hands were raw despite the gloves, and his designer stubble had given way to the beginnings of an actual beard, coated in a fine layer of dust and sweat. As they approached the house, Ethan noticed an unfamiliar truck parked in the driveway. A tall, broad-shouldered man in work clothes similar to Sarah's was leaning against it, his weathered face breaking into a smile as he spotted them. "You didn't tell me we had company coming," Ethan muttered, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance. "That's Jake Miller," Sarah replied. "Neighboring farm. He helps out sometimes and I help him when he needs it. That's how things work around here." Jake approached as they reached the house, his eyes taking in Ethan's exhausted state with barely concealed amusement. "So this is the city boy," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Jake Miller. Heard Sarah got herself a husband from Chicago." Ethan shook his hand, wincing at the man's firm grip. "Ethan Harrison." "Harrison," Jake repeated, recognition dawning in his eyes. "As in Harrison Enterprises. That Harrison." "The very same," Ethan confirmed, a hint of his old arrogance returning. At least someone here recognized his name. Jake whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned. Sarah, you didn't mention you'd married into the Fortune 500. Sarah's expression remained neutral. "It didn't seem relevant." "Brought those irrigation parts you asked for," Jake said, turning back to Sarah, "and Mum sent over some of her apple pie, said to welcome the new addition to the community." He nodded toward Ethan with a grin that wasn't entirely friendly. "Thanks, Jake. Want to stay for dinner?" "No, got to get back. Dad's expecting me." He tipped an imaginary hat to Ethan. "Nice meeting you, Harrison. Looking forward to seeing how you handle harvest season." As Jake drove away, Ethan turned to Sarah. "What did he mean about harvest season?" "It means he doesn't think you'll last," Sarah replied matter-of-factly, walking toward the house. "Most city people don't." That night, after a simple dinner eaten mostly in silence, Ethan retreated to his room. his body crying out for rest, but his mind racing. He had survived day one, but at what cost? His hands were blistered, his back felt broken, and his pride had taken a beating that no amount of designer clothes or family connections could repair. As he lay on the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, Ethan did something he rarely allowed himself to do. He questioned his own choices. How had he ended up here in this situation? Was his life in Chicago really worth all this suffering to maintain? The questions were uncomfortable, so he pushed them aside. This was temporary. He would endure, but he wouldn't embrace it. He would do the minimum required to satisfy the terms of his father's ultimatum, and then he would return to civilization, to his real life, leaving Sarah Mitchell and her struggling farm far behind. With that resolution firmly in mind, Ethan Harrison, heir to the Harrison fortune and reluctant farmhand, finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, unaware that his resistance to his new life was already beginning to crack at the foundations. 2 weeks into his farm exile, Ethan had established a routine. Each morning, he'd wake at 5, dress in his borrowed work clothes, and stumble downstairs for breakfast. He'd work alongside Sarah until sunset, collapsing into bed each night with muscles screaming in protest, only to repeat the cycle the next day. The physical toll was undeniable. His hands had developed calluses, his skin had darkened from constant sun exposure, and he'd lost the slight softness around his middle that came from too many business lunches and not enough actual exercise. But it was the mental challenge that was proving more difficult to overcome. "No, not like that," Sarah said, her patience visibly wearing thin as she watched Ethan attempt to drive the tractor in a straight line across the field. "You're cutting too wide. You'll miss half the section." Ethan gritted his teeth, frustrated and embarrassed. In Chicago, he drove high-performance sports cars with ease. Here, he couldn't seem to master a decades-old tractor that moved at the pace of a particularly sluggish turtle. "Maybe if this antique had power steering and a GPS, we wouldn't have this problem," he snapped, immediately regretting his tone. Sarah's expression hardened. "My grandfather used this tractor to feed his family during the Depression. It doesn't need bells and whistles to do its job." She climbed up beside him, reaching for the controls. "Move over. I'll show you again." Pride stinging, Ethan slid to the passenger side of the seat. He watched as Sarah handled the machine with ease, her movements confident and precise as she guided it along the perfect line. "See? You feel the rhythm of the engine, the way it pulls slightly to the left. You compensate for that. You work with the machine, not against it." There was no condescension in her voice, just matter-of-fact instruction. "Let me try again," Ethan said, determined to master this task if only to wipe the look of resigned disappointment from Sarah's face. She nodded, sliding out of the seat to let him take control. This time, Ethan focused not on where he wanted the tractor to go, but on how it felt beneath him. The vibration of the engine, the subtle pull to the left Sarah had mentioned. He adjusted his steering accordingly, and to his surprise, the machine responded, tracing a much straighter line across the field. "Better!" Sarah called from where she watched at the edge of the field. It wasn't exactly lavish praise, but Ethan felt an unexpected surge of satisfaction. The days began to blend together, each one bringing new challenges that tested both his physical endurance and his mental resilience. There was the afternoon spent repairing the barn roof under the relentless summer sun, the morning herding escaped chickens back into their coop during a downpour, and the seemingly endless task of clearing rocks from a field Sarah wanted to plant next season. None of it came naturally to him. Every task required instruction, correction, and usually several attempts before he could perform it adequately. The learning curve was steep, and his frustration mounted with each failure. "I wasn't trained for this," he complained one evening. As they sat on the porch drinking cold lemonade after a particularly brutal day of hauling irrigation pipes. "I have an MBA. I understand corporate finance and business strategy, not whatever the hell we were doing today." Sarah studied him over the rim of her glass. "No one is trained for farming, Ethan. We learn by doing, by failing, by trying." "Again, that's easy for you to say. You grew up with this." "Yes, and I still make mistakes every day," she replied evenly. 2 years ago, I lost an entire apple crop because I misjudged the weather and didn't protect the orchard from an early frost. Last year, I nearly drove the farm into bankruptcy because I tried expanding too quickly. She set her glass down with a soft clink. "The difference is, I don't give up when things get hard." The implicit criticism stung, but Ethan couldn't deny its truth. His entire life had been structured to avoid genuine hardship. When things became difficult, he simply moved on to something else, using his name and his father's money to smooth the transition. "What's the point of all this anyway?" he asked, gesturing to the sprawling farm around them. "You work yourself to exhaustion every day, and for what? You said yourself you nearly went bankrupt. Wouldn't it be easier to sell this place and do something else?" Something like pain flickered across Sarah's face. "Easier, maybe, but not better." She was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the sun was beginning to set. "This land isn't just property to me, Ethan. It's my heritage, my responsibility. When my ancestors settled here, they made a commitment to be stewards of this place, to make it productive, to care for it, to pass it on better than they found it. But that's outdated, naive," Sarah challenged. "Maybe to someone like you, who measures success in quarterly profits and stock options. But there are other ways to measure a life well lived." Before Ethan could respond, the distant rumble of thunder interrupted their conversation. Sarah stood, her expression shifting to concern as she scanned the darkening sky. "Storm's coming, a big one, from the look of those clouds." She turned to him, her demeanor suddenly all business. "We need to secure everything before it hits." The last heavy rain nearly flooded the lower fields. For the next hour they worked frantically, moving equipment under shelter, reinforcing the temporary greenhouses Sarah had constructed for seedlings, and checking that the drainage ditches were clear of debris. The wind picked up as they worked, carrying the sharp smell of rain and the distant crack of lightning. "The north field drainage is still blocked," Sarah called over the rising wind. "If we don't clear it, we'll lose the entire section." Ethan looked at the threatening sky, then back at Sarah. "Is it worth the risk? That storm is almost on top of us." "It's worth it." Her tone left no room for argument. "Those crops represent 3 months of work and a significant portion of our income for the year." Reluctantly, Ethan followed her to the pickup truck, and they drove to the north field as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. By the time they reached the drainage ditch at the field's edge, the rain was falling in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet and instantly soaking them to the skin. "There," Sarah pointed to where water was already beginning to pool, unable to drain properly because of branches and debris clogging the culvert. "We need to clear it." Without hesitation, she waded into the swiftly rising water, which already reached her knees. Ethan watched in disbelief as she began pulling at the tangled mess of branches and mud. "Are you crazy?" he shouted over the storm. "That water's rising too fast." "Then help me instead of standing there," she shouted back, struggling with a particularly large branch. Something in her determination broke through Ethan's hesitation. Cursing under his breath, he waded in beside. The cold water shocking his system as it soaked through his jeans. Together they pulled at the blockage, fighting against both the rising water and the increasingly strong current. "It's not budging," Ethan called, his hands numbing in the cold water. "Keep trying. There's a key piece somewhere in there that's holding everything else in place." Lightning cracked overhead, followed almost immediately by a deafening boom of thunder. The storm was directly above them now, making their exposed position in the field increasingly dangerous. Ethan dove deeper, feeling blindly through the murky water until his fingers closed around what felt like the trunk of a small tree. He pulled with all his strength, but it refused to move. "I think I found it," he called to Sarah, "but I can't get it loose." Without a word, she moved beside him, adding her strength to his. Together, they heaved against the submerged obstacle. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden rush, the blockage gave way. Water surged through the now clear culvert, the sudden release of pressure nearly knocking them both off their feet. "We did it!" Sarah's voice carried a rare note of triumph as she steadied herself against Ethan. The relief was short-lived. As the water level began to drop, the ground beneath their feet grew increasingly unstable. The saturated earth at the ditch's edge suddenly gave way, collapsing beneath Sarah and sending her tumbling into the now rushing water of the drainage ditch. "Sarah!" Ethan lunged for her, managing to catch her wrist before the current could sweep her away. The force of the water was startling, pulling at Sarah with enough strength that Ethan had to brace himself against the ditch's edge to maintain his grip. For a critical moment, their eyes met. Sarah's wide with surprise and a flash of fear, Ethan's determined and focused. Then, with a strength born of weeks of physical labor, he pulled her from the rushing water, both of them collapsing onto the muddy bank as the rain continued to pour down around them. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice rough with adrenaline and concern. Sarah nodded, breathing hard. "Thanks to you." She looked at him with new eyes, as if seeing something she hadn't noticed before. That was good thinking. Quick reflexes. It wasn't effusive praise, but coming from Sarah, it felt significant. They sat there for a moment, rain-soaked and mud-covered, the storm raging around them, but the immediate danger passed. "We should get back," Sarah said finally, rising to her feet and extending a hand to help Ethan up, "before we both catch pneumonia." The drive back to the farmhouse was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than usual, not tense or awkward, but companionable, the quiet of two people who had just faced and overcome a challenge together. Back at the house, they took turns showering and changing into dry clothes. When Ethan came downstairs, he found Sarah in the kitchen making hot tea, her hair still damp and curling slightly around her face. "Here," she said, handing him a steaming mug, "to ward off the chill." "Thanks." Ethan took the tea, noticing the slight tremble in Sarah's hands as she passed it to him. "Are you sure you're okay?" She nodded, wrapping her hands around her own mug. "I've been through worse storms, but I've never—" She hesitated, seeming to search for the right words. "I've never had anyone react that quickly. If you hadn't caught me—" "But I did," Ethan said simply. He didn't elaborate, didn't point out that his quick action had been instinctive, not calculated, that for perhaps the first time in his life he had acted without thinking of himself first. They sat at the kitchen table, listening to the storm rage outside, the warm light of the kitchen creating a pocket of safety amid the chaos of the elements. Ethan found himself studying Sarah's profile, noticing details he'd overlooked before. The determination in the set of her jaw, yes, but also the vulnerability in the slight furrow of her brow, the quiet strength in her posture, even after the ordeal they'd just endured. "Thank you," she said finally, meeting his gaze directly. "Not just for today, for the past 2 weeks. I know this isn't where you want to be, but you've been trying. I see that." The simple acknowledgement, delivered without fanfare, affected Ethan more deeply than he cared to admit. He'd spent years seeking his father's approval and never receiving it. Yet here was this woman, this stranger who had become his wife on paper, offering recognition of his efforts despite their inauspicious beginning. "I still don't know what I'm doing half the time," he admitted. "No one does," Sarah replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. That's farming. You just keep showing up and doing the work day after day. As the storm gradually subsided outside, something shifted within Ethan, not a dramatic transformation, but a subtle realignment, like a compass finding true north after being askew. The challenges of farm life remained daunting, the physical demands still beyond anything he'd experienced in his privileged existence, but for the first time he began to see them not as punishment, but as opportunity. Not that he would admit that to anyone, least of all himself. A month after his arrival at the Mitchell farm, Ethan woke before his alarm. The pre-dawn light filtered softly through the curtains as he lay in bed, listening to the now familiar sounds of the farmhouse. The routine that had once seemed like cruel punishment had become not exactly comfortable, but predictable. His body had adjusted to the early hours and physical demands, his hands now calloused enough that they rarely blistered, his skin tanned from daily exposure to the sun. He rose and dressed in what had become his standard attire, work jeans, flannel shirt, sturdy boots, without the internal protest that had accompanied these actions just weeks before. As he headed downstairs, he caught himself mentally reviewing the day's tasks, finishing the repairs on the eastern fence line, checking the orchard's irrigation system, and helping Sarah prepare for the farmer's market the following day. The realization that he knew the schedule, that he was anticipating the work rather than dreading it, stopped him halfway down the stairs. "What the hell is happening to me?" he muttered. In the kitchen, Sarah was already preparing breakfast, a task they now sometimes shared, though Ethan's culinary skills remained limited to toast and coffee. She glanced up as he entered, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement. Their relationship had shifted since the storm incident, the open hostility replaced by a cautious professional respect. They weren't friends exactly, but they had achieved a functional partnership that made the daily work run more smoothly. "You're up early," she commented, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him as he sat at the table. "Couldn't sleep," Ethan replied, not wanting to admit that his body had actually adapted to the farm schedule. Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee and joined him at the table, a notepad in hand. "I've been thinking about the farmer's market tomorrow. We should bring more of the early apples this time. They sold out quickly last week, and maybe some of the wildflower honey from the hives at the south end." The casual "we" didn't escape Ethan's notice. A month ago, Sarah had handled the farmer's market alone while he recovered from his first week of labor. Now it was assumed they would attend together, with Ethan helping to set up their stand and interact with customers. "I know nothing about honey," he pointed out, taking a bite of his breakfast. "You'll learn," Sarah replied matter-of-factly, "just like you learned about the apples." And he had learned, surprisingly. He could now identify 5 different varieties of apples grown on the Mitchell farm, knew when they should be harvested, and could tell a customer exactly what each was. Best used for baking, eating fresh, or making cider. It was knowledge that would have seemed utterly useless to him in his Chicago life, but now felt strangely satisfying to possess. After breakfast, they headed out to the eastern pasture, where several fence posts needed reinforcement before they could move the cattle there for grazing. It was work Ethan had botched badly during his first week, but now he handled the post-hole digger with competence, if not the same fluid efficiency as Sarah. "Your technique has improved," she commented, as she watched him set a post. It wasn't lavish praise, but Ethan found himself oddly pleased by the observation. "I had a good teacher," he replied, surprising himself with the admission. Sarah raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning back to her own work. They continued in companionable silence, the physical labor now familiar enough that Ethan's mind could wander as his body went through the motions. He thought about the message he'd received from his friend Alex the previous night. A photo of their usual group at Vapor, Chicago's most exclusive nightclub, with the caption, "Miss you, man. When are you escaping farm prison?" 6 weeks ago, that photo would have filled Ethan with envy and resentment. Now he found himself viewing it with a strange detachment, as if looking at artifacts from someone else's life. "Something on your mind?" Sarah asked, interrupting his thoughts. Ethan hesitated, then decided to answer honestly. "Just thinking about my friends back in Chicago. They're still doing the same things, parties, clubs, the usual scene." "And you miss it," Sarah said. "It wasn't a question, but an assumption." "That's the weird thing," Ethan admitted, driving the post-hole digger into the ground with more force than necessary. "I thought I would, but I don't know. It all seems kind of pointless now." Sarah studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Hard physical labor has a way of changing your perspective. When you spend all day working to create something tangible, the appeal of spending all night in a dark room drinking overpriced alcohol tends to diminish. "Is that your not-so-subtle way of saying, 'I told you so'?" Ethan asked, but there was no real annoyance in his tone. "Just an observation," Sarah replied, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "For what it's worth, I think your father would be surprised by how well you're adapting." The mention of his father brought Ethan up short. Maxwell Harrison had been notably absent from their lives, not even calling to check on his son's progress. The realization that he hadn't thought about his father in days was unsettling. "I'm not adapting," Ethan insisted, though the protest sounded weak even to his own ears. "I'm surviving. There's a difference." "If you say so," Sarah said, clearly unconvinced. They finished the fence repair before noon and moved on to the orchard, where they spent the afternoon checking irrigation lines and assessing which trees were ready for early harvest. The work was less physically demanding, but required a keen eye and careful judgment, qualities Ethan had rarely been called upon to exercise in his previous life. "These Honeycrisps are almost ready," Sarah said, examining a cluster of apples with expert attention. "Maybe another week. The galas we can start harvesting tomorrow for the market." Ethan nodded, having learned to trust Sarah's assessment of the fruit. He reached up to check a branch himself, noting the firmness of the apples and the deepening red blush on their skin, signs he now recognized as indicators of ripeness. "The east row looks good too," he offered. "I checked it yesterday when I was fixing that broken line." Sarah looked at him with mild surprise. "You're getting better at this." "Don't sound so shocked," Ethan said dryly. "Not shocked, just—" She paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Impressed, I guess. Most city people don't adapt this quickly." "I told you I'm not adapting," Ethan insisted, though the protest felt increasingly hollow. "I'm just doing what needs to be done until my sentence is over." Sarah shrugged. "Call it what you want. The results are the same." As they walked back to the house that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields, Ethan found himself looking at the farm with different eyes. What had once seemed like an endless expanse of meaningless work now appeared as distinct areas, each with its own purpose and rhythm: the orchard with its neat rows of fruit-laden trees, the vegetable gardens with their precisely timed plantings, the pastures where the small herd of cattle grazed contentedly. There was an order to it all, a purpose that he was beginning to understand, if not fully embrace. After dinner, instead of retreating to his room as he had during his first weeks, Ethan joined Sarah on the porch. The evening air was cool but pleasant, carrying the scent of ripening apples from the nearby orchard. They sat in silence for a while, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky, stars that had been invisible in Chicago's light-polluted, and nights but here shone with breathtaking clarity. "I got a call from the co-op today," Sarah said eventually. "They've confirmed they'll take all of our second-grade apples for processing. It's not the best price, but it means we won't waste any of the harvest." Ethan nodded, understanding now the complex economics of farming in a way he never could have a month ago. "What about the heritage varieties? Are we still planning to sell those direct to the specialty markets in Madison?" The "we" slipped out without his notice, but Sarah caught it, a flicker of something, surprise, satisfaction, crossing her face before she replied. "That's the plan. They'll bring a better price there." They discussed the upcoming harvest in detail, projected yields, market strategies, logistics of getting the crop from tree to buyer. It was a conversation that would have bored Ethan to tears 6 weeks earlier, but now engaged him fully. He found himself offering suggestions based on his business background, ideas that Sarah actually considered rather than dismissing outright. "We could approach some of the high-end restaurants directly," he suggested. "Chefs in Chicago are always looking for exclusive ingredients to feature on their menus. The heritage varieties would appeal to them. There's a story there, something they can sell to their customers." Sarah tilted her head, considering. "That's not a bad idea, but we'd need connections to get our foot in the door with those kinds of establishments." "Connections are something I actually have," Ethan pointed out, a hint of his old confidence returning. "I know people at every major restaurant group in Chicago. One call and we'd have meetings set up." "You'd do that?" Sarah asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Ethan hesitated, suddenly aware of the implications of his offer. This wasn't just suggesting a business strategy. This was actively investing himself in the farm's success, in Sarah's success. "Why not?" he said finally, aiming for a casual tone. "It would be nice to use my connections for something productive for once." Sarah studied him in the fading light, her expression thoughtful. "You're full of surprises, Ethan Harrison." "Is that a compliment or an observation?" he asked, echoing her earlier words. "Both, maybe," she admitted, a small smile softening her usually serious expression. They fell into silence again, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who have found an unexpected common ground. Ethan was acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted, not just in their working relationship, but in his own perception of his place on the farm. He was still counting down the days until his year was complete, still telling himself that this was temporary, that his real life awaited him back in Chicago. But the conviction behind those thoughts was weakening, eroded by the daily reality of meaningful work, and more surprisingly, by the growing respect he felt for the woman beside him. As the night deepened around them, Ethan Harrison, heir to a fortune, reluctant farmer, and increasingly confused about his own identity, found himself in the uncomfortable position of questioning everything he had once taken for granted. His resistance to farm life was giving way to something else, something he wasn't quite ready to name but could no longer deny. He was adapting, whether he wanted to admit it or not. The farmers' market in Madison was nothing like Ethan had imagined. He had expected a handful of rickety stands and a sparse crowd of health-conscious shoppers. Instead, he found himself in the midst of a vibrant community event. Dozens of colorful stalls stretching around the Capitol Square, teeming with people from all walks of life, the air filled with conversation, laughter, and the mingled scents of fresh produce, baked goods, and street food. "This is actually impressive," he admitted, as he helped Sarah unload crates of apples from her old pickup truck. They had risen at 3 that morning to make the drive to Madison and set up before the market opened at 6. "Did you think we were all just backward hicks out here in the countryside?" Sarah asked, but there was no bite to her words, just a gentle teasing that would have been unthinkable a few weeks ago. "Something like that," Ethan conceded with a self-deprecating smile. "Shows what I knew." Their stand was modest but attractive, with wooden crates displaying 5 varieties of apples, jars of honey from the farm's hives, and a small selection of late summer vegetables. Sarah had created a simple banner, reading, "Mitchell Family Farms, established, 1897, which Ethan now helped her hang across the front of their table. "The heritage varieties go here," Sarah instructed, indicating a special section of the display. "They're limited quantity, so we price them higher. Make sure customers know." They're grown from trees that have been on the farm for generations. Ethan nodded, arranging the spotted red and gold apples carefully. What's the story with these again? They're called Esopus Spitzenberg, Sarah explained. They were Thomas Jefferson's favorite apple. He grew them at Monticello. They're hard to find commercially because they don't ship or store well, but the flavor is incredible. Thomas Jefferson's favorite apple, Ethan repeated, filing away the information. Got it. As the market opened and customers began to arrive, Ethan found himself unexpectedly enjoying the experience. Sarah handled most of the transactions, but he pitched in, describing the apple varieties to curious customers, explaining the difference between wildflower and clover honey, and carefully packaging purchases. You're a natural salesman, Sarah, commented during a brief lull, looking genuinely impressed as Ethan charmed an elderly couple into buying a half-dozen of their most expensive heritage apples. Finally, something from my previous life that's actually useful here, he quipped. Around mid-morning, a well-dressed man in his 50s approached their stand, examining the apples with a professional eye. Mitchell Farms, he read from their banner. Are you Sarah Mitchell? I am, Sarah replied, stepping forward with a polite smile. James Prescott, executive chef at Harvest on Main. The man introduced himself. I've heard good things about your heritage varieties, specifically the Esopus Spitzenberg. Ethan recognized the name immediately. Harvest was one of Madison's top farm-to-table restaurants, the kind of place where reservations were needed weeks in advance. We have a limited supply, Sarah explained, but they're exceptional this year. Would you like to try one? As the chef sampled the apple, his expression shifted from professional assessment to genuine pleasure. Remarkable. The balance of sweet and tart, the complexity. You don't find this in commercial varieties. We have 5 heritage varieties altogether, Sarah said, each with its own distinct characteristics, some better for cooking, others for eating fresh. I'd be interested in featuring them on our fall menu, Prescott said. How much volume could you provide? Sarah hesitated, clearly doing mental calculations. For the Esopus, perhaps 40 pounds weekly through October. The other heritage varieties, similar amounts but with different harvest windows. That's not much, the chef frowned. What she means, Ethan interjected smoothly, is that these are exclusive varieties with limited availability, perfect for a signature dish or a special feature that sets your restaurant apart from the competition. Prescott turned to him with renewed interest. And you are? Ethan Harrison, he replied, extending his hand. I'm Sarah's partner. The word felt strange on his tongue, neither fully true nor entirely false. Harrison, the chef repeated, recognition dawning in his eyes. As in Harrison Enterprises? The same, Ethan confirmed, noting Sarah's surprised expression from the corner of his eye. I didn't realize the Harrisons had entered the agricultural sector, Prescott remarked. We're always diversifying, Ethan replied with practiced ease. Sustainable heritage farming aligns perfectly with our corporate values of tradition and innovation. The chef smiled, clearly impressed by the perceived connection to the Harrison business empire. Well, in that case, I'd be very interested in establishing a relationship. Perhaps I could visit the farm, see your operation firsthand. We'd be delighted, Ethan said, pulling out his phone. Let me get your contact information, and we can arrange something for next week. After exchanging information and agreeing on a preliminary order that was nearly double what Sarah had initially proposed, Prescott left with a box of samples for his sous chefs to experiment with. Sarah waited until he was out of earshot before turning to Ethan. What was that about? She asked, her expression a mixture of confusion and something that might have been admiration. That, Ethan replied with a grin, was business. You were underselling both your product and yourself. Those apples are worth twice what you're charging, especially to high-end restaurants looking for something distinctive. And the bit about Harrison Enterprises diversifying into heritage farming? Ethan shrugged. A small exaggeration that harmed no one and helped secure a valuable contract. I know how these people think. Dropping the Harrison name opens doors. Sarah shook her head, but she was smiling. I don't know whether to be impressed or appalled. Be impressed, Ethan suggested. We just secured a regular buyer for your most premium product at above-market prices. We, Sarah repeated softly, studying his face as if seeing something new. There, the rest of the market day passed in a blur of customers, sales, and even 2 more restaurant inquiries, prompted by Prescott's visible interest in their stand. By the time they packed up in the late afternoon, they had sold out of nearly everything and had commitments from 3 restaurants for regular orders. As they loaded the empty crates back into the truck, Ethan found himself filled with an unfamiliar sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the hollow victory of closing a corporate deal or the fleeting pleasure of an expensive purchase. It was something deeper, more substantial. They had grown these apples, tended them from blossom to harvest, and now delivered them directly to people who genuinely appreciated their value. There was an honesty to the transaction that he found unexpectedly fulfilling. Successful day, Sarah remarked as they climbed into the cab of the truck for the drive home. Very, Ethan agreed. Those restaurant contracts alone will more than cover the input costs for the orchard this year. Sarah glanced at him, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Listen to you talking about input costs and yield projections. Who are you, and what have you done with the entitled city boy who showed up at my farm 3 months ago? He's still here, Ethan assured her, though the protest felt half-hearted even to him. Just adapting to the circumstances. Sarah hummed skeptically, starting the engine. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the late afternoon sun casting golden light across the rolling Wisconsin landscape. Ethan found himself watching Sarah's profile as she drove. The determined set of her jaw, the quiet confidence in her posture, the way the sunlight caught in her chestnut hair, bringing out hidden auburn highlights. Why did you agree to this arrangement? He asked suddenly. The question that had been lurking in the back of his mind for months, finally finding voice. With my father, I mean. The marriage. Sarah kept her eyes on the road, but he saw her hands, tighten slightly on the steering wheel. You know why. The farm was in trouble. The bank was foreclosing. Your father offered a solution. But there must have been other options. Loans, grants, selling part of the land. I tried all that, Sarah replied, a hint of old frustration coloring her voice. The banks wouldn't extend more credit. Agricultural grants are competitive and limited, and selling part of the land. She shook her head firmly. That was never an option. This farm has been whole since 1897. I wasn't going to be the one to break it up. So you agreed to marry a stranger instead, Ethan said softly. Me, specifically. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Your father showed me your picture. Told me about you. Said you needed to learn the value of hard work and real consequences. A smile flickered across her face. He didn't mention you'd be such a pain in the ass for the first month. Only the first month? Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. You've improved, she conceded, marginally. They both laughed, the sound filling the truck's cab with unexpected warmth. For what it's worth, Ethan said after a moment, I'm sorry you were put in that position, having to choose between your farm and, well, being tied to someone like me. Sarah glanced at him, genuine surprise in her eyes. That might be the first sincere apology I've ever heard from you. Don't get used to it, he warned, but there was no bite to his words. When they returned to the farm, the day's work wasn't over. The evening chores still needed attention, animals to be fed, irrigation to be checked, preparations for the next day's harvest to be made. But instead of the reluctant compliance that had marked Ethan's early weeks, he now moved through these tasks with the ease of familiarity, even taking initiative on certain jobs without being asked. After dinner, tired but satisfied with the day's accomplishments, they sat on the porch as had become their custom. The evening was unusually warm for September, the air heavy with the scent of ripening apples and the distant perfume of wildflowers from the meadow beyond the orchard. "I've been thinking about those restaurant connections," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence. "We could expand that side of the business. There's a small parcel on the western edge that would be perfect for heirloom vegetables, the kind of specialty produce those high-end chefs are always looking for." Ethan nodded, intrigued by the idea. "We'd need to run the numbers, see if the premium prices justify the extra labor, but it could be a good diversification strategy." "Look at you, Mr. MBA," Sarah teased, "using your powers for good instead of evil." "Don't tell anyone," Ethan replied with a mock-serious expression. "It would ruin my reputation." Their laughter mingled in the evening air, easier and more genuine than ever before. When it faded, Ethan found himself looking at Sarah with new eyes, not as the obstacle to his return to Chicago, not as his temporary jailer, but as a person of remarkable strength, intelligence, and determination. "What?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just thinking." "Dangerous activity," she remarked dryly. "Apparently." He hesitated, then added, "Thank you for today, for teaching me about all of this." His gesture encompassed the farm spread out around them, bathed in the soft light of sunset. Sarah's expression softened, a genuine smile transforming her features. "You're welcome," she said simply. Something shifted between them in that moment, subtle but unmistakable. The contractual nature of their relationship, always present like an invisible barrier, seemed to recede, replaced by something more authentic, more human. Not romance, not yet, but a connection based on shared experience, mutual respect, and the gradual discovery that they were, perhaps, not so different after all. As darkness settled over the farm and stars began to appear in the clear night sky, Ethan Harrison, heir to a fortune and reluctant farmer, found himself facing an unexpected truth. Some part of his heart, a part he had carefully guarded behind walls of privilege and indifference, had begun to connect with this place, this life, and most surprisingly, with the strong, principled woman beside him. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. The autumn harvest was in full swing, transforming the Mitchell farm into a hive of activity. For 6 weeks, Ethan and Sarah had worked from dawn until dusk, picking apples, sorting them by quality, and preparing shipments for their growing list of restaurant clients and farmers' market customers. The physical demands were greater than anything Ethan had experienced before, but he no longer noticed the aching muscles and perpetual exhaustion. Instead, he found himself taking pride in each day's accomplishments, in the tangible evidence of their labor. They had fallen into an efficient partnership, each recognizing the other's strengths. Sarah's deep knowledge of farming and produce quality was complemented by Ethan's business acumen and negotiation skills. Together, they had increased the farm's direct sales by over 40%, commanding premium prices for their heritage varieties and specialty products. More surprising than their professional success, however, was the personal relationship that had developed between them. The initial antagonism had given way to mutual respect, and respect had gradually transformed into something deeper, a connection that neither had anticipated nor actively sought, but which had grown naturally from their shared challenges and triumphs. It was an unseasonably warm October afternoon when the black sedan appeared on the farm's gravel driveway, the expensive vehicle looking as out of place as Ethan himself had once felt. He was in the barn, calculating the week's apple yield, when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Stepping outside, he froze at the sight of his father's driver opening the car's rear door. Maxwell Harrison emerged, immaculate as always, in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most of the farm equipment combined. His cold blue eyes surveyed the property with calculated assessment before settling on his son. "Ethan," he said, his tone neutral. "Dad," Ethan replied suddenly, conscious of his work clothes, the dirt under his fingernails, the 3-day stubble on his jaw. "This is unexpected." "I thought it was time to check on my investment," Maxwell replied, "both financial and familial." Before Ethan could respond, Sarah emerged from the orchard, carrying a crate of freshly picked apples. She stopped when she saw Maxwell, then set down her load and approached, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Mr. Harrison," she greeted him, her tone professional but wary. "We weren't expecting you." "Clearly," Maxwell remarked, glancing pointedly at their work attire. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just the fall harvest," Sarah replied evenly. "Our busiest season." "Our," Maxwell repeated, a hint of amusement in his voice, as his gaze shifted between them. "Interesting choice of words." Ethan stepped forward, placing himself slightly between his father and Sarah. "Why are you here, Dad? It's been almost 6 months without so much as a phone call." "As I said, I wanted to check on my investment," Maxwell replied smoothly, "and to discuss the future, perhaps somewhere more civilized than a barnyard." The three of them moved to the farmhouse, the tension palpable as they settled in the kitchen. Sarah made coffee, her movements precise and controlled, while Ethan struggled to read his father's inscrutable expression. "The farm appears to be in good condition," Maxwell observed, accepting the mug Sarah offered him, but not drinking from it. "I've been receiving the financial reports. Your revenue is up substantially compared to previous years." "We've expanded our direct sales channels," Sarah explained. "Specialty restaurants, high-end markets, the margins are better." "Again, with the we," Maxwell noted, his gaze shifting to Ethan. "You've been more involved than I anticipated." Ethan met his father's eyes, refusing to look away. Someone had to help run the business side of things. It made sense to leverage my background. "Indeed." Maxwell set down his untouched coffee. "And have you found this agricultural experiment enlightening, Ethan? Has it taught you the lessons I intended?" The condescension in his father's tone sparked a flare of anger in Ethan's chest. 6 months ago, he would have responded with equal disdain, or perhaps with the sullen resentment of a chastised child. Now, he found himself responding with a calm certainty that surprised even him. "It's taught me more than you could have imagined," he said. "About hard work, yes, about responsibility, but also about building something real, something that matters." Maxwell's eyebrows rose slightly. "How very philosophical. Perhaps farming agrees with you after all." He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the table between them. "In any case, I've come to discuss next steps." "Next steps?" Sarah asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the house. "Yes," Maxwell confirmed. "The original agreement was for 1 year. We're at the halfway point, and I'm prepared to offer an adjustment to our arrangement." Ethan glanced at the envelope but didn't touch it. "What kind of adjustment?" "An early release, you might say." Maxwell tapped the envelope with one manicured finger. "Inside, you'll find papers dissolving the marriage contract, along with a generous settlement for Ms. Mitchell. In exchange for her cooperation, the farm mortgage will be forgiven entirely, and she'll receive additional capital for expansion." "And for me?" Ethan asked, his voice carefully controlled. "You return to Chicago immediately, resume your position at Harrison Enterprises. All privileges restored, of course." Maxwell's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "I believe you've learned your lesson, and the company could use your newfound work ethic. Silence fell over the kitchen as the implications of Maxwell's offer sank in. 6 months instead of a year. Freedom from the arrangement that had been forced upon both of them. Financial security for Sarah and the farm. A return to civilization for Ethan. It was everything they should have wanted. Everything they had originally wanted. Why now? Ethan finally asked. Maxwell straightened his already perfect cuffs. Our Asian expansion is moving ahead of schedule. I need all hands on deck, including yours. The board has approved a new executive position that would suit your abilities. It's a significant opportunity, Ethan. Ethan looked at Sarah, trying to gauge her reaction, but her expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing of her thoughts. He turned back to his father. Can we have some time to discuss this? He asked. Maxwell frowned slightly. Discuss? There's nothing to discuss. This is what you both wanted from the beginning. I'm simply accelerating the timeline. He checked his watch. My driver can wait an hour while you pack your essentials. Anything else can be shipped later. An hour? Ethan repeated incredulously. Dad, we're in the middle of the harvest. I can't just walk away. Can't? Maxwell's voice carried a dangerous edge. Or won't? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ethan felt a strange tightness in his chest, a clarity cutting through the confusion of the moment. He looked around the kitchen, at the worn but well-cared-for furniture, the basket of fresh apples on the counter, the mud-caked boots by the door, and realized with startling certainty that this place had become more than just a temporary prison. It had become home. Both, he said softly. Then with more conviction, both. I can't walk away from the responsibilities I've taken on here, and I won't abandon Sarah in the middle of our busiest season. Maxwell's expression hardened. Don't be ridiculous, Ethan. You're not a farmer. You're a Harrison. This was meant to be a lesson, not a lifestyle change. Maybe the lesson worked better than you intended, Ethan replied, moving to stand beside Sarah. I've learned what it means to build something with my own hands, to work for something that matters, to be part of something larger than myself. Noble sentiments, Maxwell said dismissively, but this fantasy ends today. Either you return to Chicago with me now, or the original deal is nullified entirely. That means no forgiven mortgage, no settlement, no continued support for this. He gestured vaguely around them. Rustic enterprise. Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Harrison, with all due respect, you can't threaten us with the loss of something we've already learned to live without. The farm is profitable now. Our new contracts will cover the mortgage payments. We don't need your money. We again, Maxwell observed coldly. How cozy you two have become. He turned to Ethan, his expression calculating. Is that what this is about? You've developed feelings for your farmer bride, a charming but predictable plot twist. This isn't about my feelings, Ethan countered, though he felt heat rise to his face. It's about integrity, commitment, seeing something through to the end. Admirable qualities, Maxwell conceded, but misplaced in this situation. Your place is in Chicago, running the company that will one day be yours. Maybe I don't want it, Ethan said, the words escaping before he could consider their weight. Maybe I've found something better. A heavy silence fell. Maxwell's face, normally so controlled, showed genuine shock before settling into cold anger. You would throw away your birthright, generations of wealth and influence, for this? Gestured around the kitchen. For her? I'm not throwing anything away, Ethan replied steadily. I'm choosing something else, something real. Maxwell stood abruptly, buttoning his suit jacket with precise movements. I see I've wasted my time, and apparently my money as well. He retrieved the envelope from the table. The original agreement stands. 1 year. After that, you'll receive nothing from me or the Harrison estate. Ever." He fixed Ethan with a hard stare. "Is that clear?" "Crystal," Ethan replied, not backing down. Without another word, Maxwell turned and walked out, his footsteps sharp against the wooden floor. They heard the front door close, then the sound of the car engine starting up. Neither Ethan nor Sarah moved until the sound of tires on gravel had faded completely into silence. "You shouldn't have done that," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan turned to her, surprised. "Done what?" "Turned him down. That was your chance to escape, to go back to your real life." She wouldn't meet his eyes. "You're giving up everything?" "Am I?" he asked softly. Sarah finally looked at him, her hazel eyes searching his face. "Your inheritance, your position, your future, everything you've ever known. For something better," Ethan completed his earlier thought. "Sarah, these past 6 months have shown me what a real life actually looks like. Building something with your own hands, working towards something meaningful, seeing the direct impact of your efforts." "But you were born to run Harrison Enterprises," she protested. "Not to pick apples in Wisconsin." "I was born," Ethan corrected, "gently, to find my own path. It just took me 30 years and a forced marriage to a stubborn farmer to figure out what that path should be." A hint of a smile touched Sarah's lips. "Stubborn, among other things," he conceded, returning the smile. They stood in the kitchen, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, casting a golden glow over the simple, honest space they had come to share. Outside, the orchard waited, apples ripening on branches, the harvest only half complete. Beyond that, the uncertain future stretched before them, a future without the safety net of Harrison wealth, but rich with possibility. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, the question encompassing far more than just the immediate future. Ethan reached out, tentatively taking her hand in his. When she didn't pull away, he felt something unlock in his chest, a warmth that had been building slowly over months of shared labor and quiet evenings. "Now," he said, "we finish the harvest, we fulfill our contracts, we plan for next season." He paused, his thumb brushing lightly over her calloused knuckles. "Together, if that's what you want." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, then back, up at him, her expression softening into something he had rarely seen, vulnerability, hope, perhaps even the beginning of love. "Together," she agreed softly. Outside, the black sedan disappeared down the long driveway, carrying away the last vestiges of Ethan's former life. But as he stood in the warm kitchen, hand in hand with the woman who had taught him the value of hard work and honest living, he felt no regret, only the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Maxwell Harrison had compelled his son to marry a simple farmer to teach him humility, but he never expected that Ethan would find not just humility, but purpose, meaning, and ultimately love, treasures more valuable than any fortune his father could offer or withhold. As the autumn sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the orchard they had tended together, Ethan and Sarah stepped out onto the porch, ready to complete the day's work and begin the next chapter of a story neither could have imagined just 6 months before. A story of their own making, rooted in the rich soil of the Mitchell family farm. 1 year later, Maxwell Harrison's sleek black sedan once again made its way up the gravel driveway of Mitchell family farms. The anniversary of Ethan's arranged marriage had arrived, marking the official end of their agreement. Maxwell stepped out of the car, his expression inscrutable as he surveyed the property. The farm had visibly prospered in the past year. New equipment stood near the barn, the orchard had expanded with young saplings, and a small farm store had been built near the entrance, showcasing their premium produce and specialty products. He found Ethan and Sarah not in the fields or the house, but in the newly renovated office attached to the farm store. They were reviewing contracts together, their heads bent close over a laptop, so engaged in their work they didn't notice his arrival until he cleared his throat. "Dad," Ethan said, surprised but not alarmed, as he stood to greet his father. "We weren't expecting you." "The terms of our agreement have reached their conclusion," Maxwell replied formally. "I came to assess the situation." Sarah rose as well, standing beside Ethan. The distance between them was minimal, their shoulders nearly touching, the comfortable proximity of two people who had grown into a genuine partnership. Maxwell's gaze took in the office with its modern technology and traditional farm ledgers, the framed photograph of Ethan and Sarah at the State Agricultural Fair, where they'd won awards for their heritage apple varieties, the business plan for Harrison Mitchell Farms, tacked to the bulletin board. "You've built something here," Maxwell observed, his tone revealing a hint of reluctant admiration. "We have," Ethan agreed simply. "And you're still certain this is what you want?" Ethan glanced at Sarah, their hands finding each other in a gesture so natural it required no thought. "More certain than I've ever been about anything." Maxwell nodded once, reaching into his jacket to retrieve an envelope. "Then perhaps you should have this." Inside was not the disinheritance papers they expected, but a wedding gift, a proper one, a year delayed, the deed to the adjacent property they'd been hoping to acquire for expansion, and a note that read simply, "Sometimes the teacher becomes the student. Congratulations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us."